Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and I'm here with Major Solomon Berg, and we're going to be doing what might be considered a groundbreaking interview about his dealings with an off-world race that is comprised of what we know of as, in some cases, Sasquatch, in some cases, Yetis, and they go by some other names out there as well. Apparently, Major Berg is saying that they actually prefer the word Squatch, or I guess Yeti is okay, and we can get into that in more detail. So, Major Berg, do you want to explain who you are and how you decided to come forward and contact me? And you are I guess, a doctor of anthropology and also a major. Are you a major in the United States Army or a Navy, or a major in in where you're located? Or can you explain that as well?
I have maintained the title major despite my current what you could call outlaw status. My last posting was with the United States Marine Corps as part of a group called Project Black Kraken, which, as I mentioned to you on our previous phone call, was a kind of military think tank. Really, our goal was to push the boundaries of science. We did a lot of what, I guess, in the conventional world you could call paranormal research. I initially was recruited into this program in my senior year of high school. I was planning on enlisting anyway. I was going to do ROTC. I was contacted by an individual that I have known throughout the years only as Owl. And Owl informed me that due to my test scores, I had been sort of investigated by a higher cabal of leaders within the military who were looking to recruit talent. So I was educated, was put through college and graduate school at the same time as I was rising through the ranks of the Marine Corps. I was never in active combat deployment technically, although I was present as a cultural liaison during what became known as the Stargate incidents in Baghdad in 2007 and Kabul in 2008. And sometime after that, I returned to the States, and I was doing civilian work, really, at that time, research. I was informed about a Mars program, and I spent a year in the Mars program, and then came back to Earth and did more research. Again, I do have a civilian identity, or I did have a civilian identity. I was working out of Temple University, and I did some very interesting research in the area of human-animal communication. And it was that research that got the attention of my colonel, Lionel Sperlinghetti. He reached back out to me and asked if I could rejoin Project Black Kraken because they had captured an entity in the Pacific Northwest outside of Seattle. This is the being that I have referred to as Squatch. Squatch, do you want me to clarify the term Squatch?
Yeah.
So Squatch is a human approximation of a noise that these creatures make when they're very young. And they don't have human individual names like we do. They have sort of a title system. So you earn your title title in their society. And before they earn their title, the young ones are just called Squatch. So it's the collective term, but it also is sort of a term for like the cohort. It indicates someone who has not yet taken a title. So, for example, one of the elders of this species that I have never had any direct contact with, but which I know of through the Overmind connection that we talked about, which I can explain further, is the Wizard of Washington. So this is a very, very old male Squatch who his hair is completely gray. He's been a recluse for hundreds of years. These are very long-lived creatures. They have an adolescence lasting about 200 years. Their adulthood could be as much as a millennia. So
Okay.
the military had, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Before we kind of go into those details, I'm trying to paint the picture and give a setting to this because so people don't get kind of confused. So at a certain point, the military brought you in because you have some unique abilities. Can you explain what those abilities are?
Yes. So I am a kind of sensitive. I have developed a particular mode of telepathic communication, which is effective between human beings and other placental mammals that have a brain structure called a corpus callosum. So, as I'm sure you're aware, there are different types of mammals. You have placentals, you have marsupials, you have monotremes. Those other kinds of mammals, like reptiles and birds, lack that structure, the corpus callosum, which permits rapid communication between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. Now, what I discovered was that the corpus callosum also had telepathic organelles within the nucleus of its cells. And by stimulating those organelles, it was possible for a human being to telepathically commune with another placental mammal or with any sort of evolutionary parallel or analog of a placental mammal. So Squatch, being a creature with a corpus callosum, I was able to communicate with Squatch on a very intuitive and emotional level. The overmind I referred to before was something I discovered early in my communications with Squatch. The overmind is a kind of collective consciousness, and it is it's not a hive mind. They retain their individuality, but there is a sort of communal web of belonging, I would describe it as. It's very comforting and different from what most humans experience in our very hyper individualized atomistic world.
Okay. Now, when you started though with the military, how did they tap into this? Were you already writing papers and had become an anthropologist at that point? Okay. So you become known as someone who, were you advocating some form of communication with, was it the Yeti or Squatch, as you call them, or was it?
Well, prior to being informed about Squatch, when I was primarily working as a civilian, with military funding, and still maintaining my connections with Project Black Kraken, but I was doing this out of Temple University. I tried to publish papers about the telepathic communication I was able to achieve. And I believe I used the word laughingstock with you in our phone call. So they had another name for me, Dr. Doolittle.
Sure.
So it was, we're talking about, I'm trying to get good research published, but because of the subject matter, none of my peers who are responsible for the peer review are willing to take it seriously. So I couldn't get it published. But that was annoying, but it wasn't that big a deal because I already was involved in Project Black Kraken. I already knew more than conventional scholars knew. I had a lot of unconventional views, especially about human evolution and about extraterrestrial intervention in human evolution, about ancient contact with extraterrestrial civilizations and intergalactic cosmic events that have affected Earth for at least millennia, if not millions of years. So I was already in that world. So I do get some amount of validation from that I couldn't get from my academic peers.
Okay, so you were already sort of in the military at that point. You were already.
Yes, I've been in the military the whole time. I've been in the military since I was 18 years old.
Okay. Now
I went to boot camp like every other Marine.
Okay. Now you went to Mars before you got involved in the whole sort of off-planet races aspect, at least as far as the Squatch go.
Yes.
So I know my audience would be particularly interested in that. So if we can just start off with that and kind of get that out of the way so that we can delve a bit more into your current situation.
Yeah.
Go ahead. If you can describe how you got to go to Mars and what you did there and so on and so forth.
This goes back to 2010s. This was after my service as a liaison in the Middle East. So I returned to the States and I was contacted again by Owl. And Owl said he had a position that was off-world that might interest me. Now, I had already, so when I was 18 and I was inducted into Black Kraken, they had showed me the Roswell footage. So I was aware of who the Greys were. Well, I did to an extent. I knew about Greys. I wouldn't say I knew everything about them. But I had a basic outline, I suppose, in my head about the extent of the U.S. government and military's involvement with extraterrestrial factions. And it was during my service in the Middle East that I learned that the Greys were essentially mercenaries. And that kind of blew my mind, because if they were mercenaries, then who were they mercenaries for? So I encountered them during the Stargate incidents. I was later briefed and told about two interstellar factions, the Guardian Alliance and the Luciferian Alliance. And I believe that the Luciferian Alliance centers around the Draco Empire. And the Guardian Alliance centers around the Palladian Empire. So I wanted to, when Owl contacted me, he was kind of reminding me that we had a grander duty, in the universe, as a planet that is affected by this ongoing struggle between lightness and darkness. So I took the position. I traveled on board one of Black Kraken's ships to Mars. This was in 2010. I spent almost a year on the Martian surface. I was based at an underground compound in the region called Cydonia. Cydonia is famous as the site of the face on Mars, Now, there is an archaeological dig site near the face. It is the site of an ancient battle. And it was at that grid that I studied artifacts. Now, my research assistant was with me at that time. His name is Daniel Jordan. He's a master sergeant, Daniel Jordan. And Master Sergeant Daniel Jordan and I combed the area for debris which had been left by ancient Martian soldiers. Now, Carrie, when I say Martian soldier, I'm not indicating Martian as a species. We are talking about Martian nationals. This was in an ancient epoch where Mars was a very cosmopolitan, multicultural world. And so many of the Martian soldiers I'm referring to were, in fact, human beings. They were transplants from ancient Earth, which was at that time ruled by kingdoms like Atlantis. And of course, there were more primitive human groups that the Atlanteans sort of had dominion over and watched over and protected and would also conscript from. So the thing you need to understand about archaeology is that when you're doing archaeology, you're usually looking at things people threw away. You're going through latrines, dig sites, dump sites, refuse sites. So we were looking at basically soldiers' trash. There was one artifact I was able to smuggle home. It was a stone pipe that appears to have been carved by a teenage human conscript in the army of Mars, used to smoke a Martian psychoactive herb and then discarded out the back of a tent before the senior officer could catch him. So that's the kind of artifacts I was looking at. It wasn't, I suppose, what you would imagine is like ancient power generators or sentient computers, and none of that lasted. It was just the bare basics.
Okay. Now, when you make a description like that, where you say he was a conscript, he threw it out the tent, how can you know this? Were you working with remote viewers? Are you yourself seeing it as a remote viewer? How did you tap into that?
We did work with remote viewers on Mars. That was part of our contingent. So they were able to get visual impressions. We analyzed the substance, the residue that was found in the pipe. Daniel Jordan actually smoked some of it. He wrote a report based on that.
Now, is he aware that you're going public?
Daniel Jordan, yes, he's my subordinate.
Understand. So you're still you're still working with him, is what you're saying?
He's still part of Project Black Kraken. What happened was, fast forward 2018, when the issue with the Sasquatch, the Squatch came up. I'm still trying to break the habit of saying Sasquatch. That's when Project Black Kraken went rogue.
What do you mean?
I'm here in Israel with my team.
Okay, I think now we've kind of made a big jump. So I just want to be clear to everyone, because we haven't quite explained that. So you've got this project, you're working on Mars, you've got someone working with you, you found artifacts, you were there for less than a year, you said.
11 months.
What?
11 months.
Okay, and can you describe, because everyone wants to know this sort of thing, did you see other beings, other types of races of beings? Were you sequestered in a certain area, and did you have breathable air in that particular area of Cydonia? Maybe we could just run through that quickly before we jump to your earthly situation?
So Mars has a variable climate. So there are parts of Mars that are habitable, that people can more or less be comfortable in. And there are parts of Mars where you would have to use gear to survive. So Cydonia was in one of the more temperate regions. So I was often working without a spacesuit, but I did have to use like a breathing filter. I did have some gear, but I was unencumbered by like anything really bulky, which, you know, made the digging easier. There is plant life. It's sparse. Mars definitely doesn't have the biodiversity of Earth, but there is life there. Certainly less life than there used to be.
Okay, and are you aware of how the surface of Mars ended up the way it is?
Millennia of war. You know, we can't isolate one particular causal factor, but from deciphering glyphs and ancient texts, we have been able to glean some details. We know that there was a prominent human faction on Mars that was under the leadership of an individual named Chrysalix. Now, Chrysalix was a half human, half Anunnaki hybrid. Chrysalix ascended to the top leadership position of ancient Mars, and he stoked resentment between two other non-human species, both of which claimed to be indigenous to Mars, but probably neither of them are. But they've both been there longer than humans.
Okay, and what species are those?
So there is an insectoid species called the trogs. But when I say insectoid, I'm not talking about something like the mantids. I'm talking about, these are sort of, they were an experiment, I believe. They're not a natural species. Imagine a deformed human, almost like a caveman, and then the other side of their body is insect-like. So they would actually like have one human eye and one compound eye. Well, more than one compound eye, but one large compound eye, and, you know, antennae and feelers on one side of the head, a modified limb. So they were almost like half human, half insect. And that was the trogs. They are tunnel dwellers. There was also a reptilian species on Mars that could loosely be called a Draco subspecies. Think about, you know, the Dracos have certain imperatives about genetic purity. These would be the cast-off Dracos.
Okay, so
Chrysalix's title was the Supreme Technocrat.
all right, you know, there's so much we can go into with regard to Mars. Just because when I spoke to you before, you said you did know Randy Kramer, and you are a Marine. He is a Marine, and
Yes.
You said he was something of a hero. Did you say that?
Yes. Now I don't know him personally. We've been at the same events. You know, he's a bit older than me. So we didn't serve on Mars at the same time. And obviously he was in combat and I was a non-combat officer. I was a support officer.
Okay, and he was in battles. Was he in battles with, to your understanding, with the reptoids and the insectoids?
Yes, the trogs.
Trogs, yeah.
I call them the Martian reptoids, just to distinguish them from the ones we're familiar with.
All right, so the Martian
They're more of a
reptoids
localized
and
group.
the trogs, right?
Yeah.
Two different species.
Yes.
But when you were there, did you actually see these species?
I did see them, but that was after I had already seen the artifacts. They prefer to expose you in stages. So like first I saw the Roswell footage, and then I was told that there were other extraterrestrial species besides just the familiar grays. So this was, as I was ascending through the military hierarchy and as I was being educated and groomed to be a military scientist, I was increasingly made aware of these things and permitted to see more. But I was always kept on something of a short leash on Mars. There were times when I was transported places where my expertise was needed and I was blindfolded.
Okay. Were you informed as to why the secrecy? Because when you came back after that time on Mars, what were you told? Why were you told? It had to be above top secret. Did they explain that?
You mean why the general public couldn't be made aware of our programs on Mars?
Yes.
Well, they gave me an explanation, but it wasn't a satisfying explanation. It was, national security, the same old.
Nothing.
I've been in the room where the sausage is made, so I did what I'm supposed to do, which is accept the explanation, not question it. But obviously, I buy it? No. I knew that there were less earthbound reasons for the secrecy.
Okay. Now, how did you? Some people will want to know this. How did you get to Mars?
I went on one of Black Kraken's ships. So
did it go interdimensional?
Well, that's not how I would describe how its FTL drive works. The ships that Black Kraken uses are Black Kraken ships. They're not identical to like the Orion class vessels of Solar Warden or Radiant Guardian. They're smaller. They're sort of designed as armored troop transports. So this is a smaller ship that uses a fusion pulse drive for sublight maneuvering. And are you familiar with fusion pulse drive technology?
Well, only by name. I'm not. I don't have a scientist's understanding of what that really is.
So this is essentially where you throw nuclear bombs out the back of your ship in order to generate a propulsive force. So your fuel is nuclear bombs, warheads. But these ships do have an FTL drive that is based on scalar loop formations. It's a kind of scalar wave generator that approximates the effects of a localized wormhole.
Okay, well, that's what I consider to be going interdimensional, but in shorthand. Okay, fair enough. So were you there you say you had one person at least under you. Were you there with a whole team of people that were actually, part of your team kind of thing? And can you say how many in your team?
It varied because, we weren't there as one. We were on different service contracts. So I was there for a tour. Master Sergeant Daniel Jordan was there at the same time as I was, and we were pretty consistent. We were bunkmates. And during that time, people were rotated on and off base. There might have been periods where they were sent to another base, another compound. There are multiple Mars bases, obviously, and multiple colonies. Not all of them are under human jurisdiction, and not all of them are under U.S. jurisdiction. I'm well aware of a thriving German community on Mars, but I did not have much interaction with that German community.
Okay, now I'm going to sort of push that to the side so that we can get into the meat of the interview, so we weren't here all night. But obviously, would love to have you back to get into more detail because I know a lot of people would like to know. So if that's going to be possible, that would be great. But at this point, I'd like to turn to what your skill set was, how it got discovered after your bout in Mars. Again, was it based to come back to Earth? What did you do to draw attention to yourself in a certain way? Why did they assign you to this Squatch? individual that they captured?
Well, when the journals refused to publish my work, I sent my findings to Black Kraken. I got a visit from Owl. Owl always seems to know how to find me. Whenever there's been a time when Black Kraken or some other arm of the military needs me, Owl has been able to locate me. I don't stay hidden. I just am a pretty low-key guy. I don't maintain a very visible presence online. I try not to draw a lot of attention to myself, so that I can really just have the time and space to focus on what I'm passionate about, which is my work. So in the course of developing the human-animal communication techniques, I first started experimenting, having telepathic conversations with my cat, Gnome, and progressed from there to laboratory tests where I communicated with chimpanzees, pigs, dolphins. We discovered there was a hard limit, that we could only achieve communication using this technique with placental mammals. Carrie, I have stared for hours at kangaroos. Nothing. Silence. They have very quiet minds. And it's because they have that reptilian mind.
Oh.
The reptilian brain. The marsupial has a much more reptilian brain. So
it's closer to a bird in a certain sense.
Yes, and birds also lack that organic brain structure, the corpus callosum. So even though many species of bird can be very intelligent, it's a different kind of intelligence. They don't have the same kind of quality of communication between the two hemispheres of their brains. So they don't quite synthesize information in the same way that placental mammals with our more complex brains do. And so Squatch has a complex brain like a placental mammal. There is a structure in Squatch's brain that is similar to the corpus callosum, similar enough that the telepathic organelles in that structure were capable of exchanging information with telepathic organelles in my corpus callosum. So,
okay, but before we go there, just to finish the thought.
I realize I should back up a bit.
Yeah, if you can explain, because you were saying that you wrote these papers, you were doing these experiments. Was this at a certain organization? And then Al came and found you when they, I guess, captured this Squatch, as you call it?
Well, they already knew me. I was still maintaining my ties with Black Kraken as a research community. So I was sending my findings to Black Kraken because who else would take me seriously? Like I said, they call me Dr. Doolittle. Project Black Kraken recognized the importance of my work and continued to fund and support me as I achieved increasingly more complex communication, first with various earth animals. And then as the need arose, they brought me in on the Squatch project. So my understanding, because I was not there when this happened, but at some point in probably 2017, the US military captured one of these entities. He is a young male Squatch, what we would call a bachelor Squatch. He is approximately 300 years old. And that is, in Squatch terms, about like a 22-year-old human. So young. Still basically a kid, but independent.
Okay.
So
when they brought you in, do they have to bring you into an underground base? I mean, where do they hold, where were they holding? Are you at liberty to say where they were holding this captured?
Broadly, I can say that I visited the Squatch on a base in the Pacific Northwest. It was at that time considered not advisable to remove the Squatch from the environment he was found in. However, it came to light that both of the factions I mentioned earlier, the interstellar factions, had an interest in using the existence of the Squatch and its species history with both the Draco and Palladian empires propagandistically. And because of our government's infiltration by Dracos, it was a decision we made as Project Black Kraken to remove the Squatch from Draco influences here in the United States. Our concern is, this gets a bit complicated. So, as I mentioned before, on the intergalactic scale, there are two major, I would call them alliances or coalitions, and one is centered around light work and the other is centered around domination. But within the framework of the light workers, there has still been a history of conflict. So when we talk about Palladians, when I've engaged with less, I would say with more credulous people, I have heard Palladians described in almost exclusively like heroic or even religious terms. And that's, I think, that says more about us than it does about any extraterrestrial intelligence. So I don't think you can judge an entire species based on its government. So when I say this, I want to be very clear, just as, you know, a large number of the people in Project Black Kraken are Jewish. We're currently guests of the Israeli government, but we're American Jews, so we have our issues with both the U.S. and the Israeli governments. You can't judge an entire alien species by the actions of its government. So the Palladians, their empire does have a history of expansion, and Squatch's species were refugees, but they were also refugees in the Draco Dominion. So neither empire has been particularly good for Squatch. There are no heroes to the Squatch. You know, heroes are an oppressive Western construct. You know, it's almost, it's like asking a Holocaust survivor, you know, who did the most for them. They're going to resent the question. So with that, I was considered the person who was best situated to be able to exchange quality information to really communicate on an emotional and spiritual level with Squatch, because of my background in anthropology, because of my work as a liaison, and because of my knowledge of primate behavior and ecology. Squatch is an alien primate, just like we are Earth-based primates.
Okay, so when you initially contacted me, you said that you had actually, and you've kind of said it, but not in straight up, you know, right, perfectly clear terms. You were in a situation after you'd been working with Squatch and the U.S. government in whatever capacity, you know, you were with, I guess, if you call it Kraken or whatever organization it worked with Kraken within well, I call it the Secret Space Program, but whatever. And that you had to leave. You decided to take him and leave. And so you actually escaped. I don't know if you call it escaped. You escaped from our country, the United States, to Israel, and I believe isn't it underground in Israel?
Yes.
Okay. So can you kind of describe that setting? And then also it's important for people to realize that. So Squatch views Pleiadians and Draco with suspicion, but
Yes.
they were willing to consider you because you were kind of neither on one side or the other, so to speak.
Right. I think Squatch is comfortable with Jews. I think Squatch senses a kind of kindred history, given that, we are both
in the universe. And so they were actually a rogue species and became a rogue species.
A diaspora people without a home for many, many years. Squatch was very comfortable with me. I had to do a lot to gain Squatch's trust. A lot of it was involving humor. That was really what worked in order for Squatch, because Squatch is a sapient being. In order for Squatch to really let me in to his mind, I first had to get to Squatch's heart, and I got to Squatch's heart with humor. Can I tell you what I did to make Squatch laugh?
Yeah, please.
I wore a gorilla mask.
Oh. Okay, and that made him laugh.
Yes. Well, laughter as his species would produce it. Okay. They are able to learn English. They are able to learn human languages, and they even can pass for human if they shave their body hair and file their teeth.
Okay. Their general height is, what did you say it was?
Well, the one that I've seen is about 7 feet tall. Now that one is very young, and they become taller and more conspicuous as they age. So I think they can reach 8 or 9 feet. The females are smaller and larger boned than the males. The males tend to be kind of tall, lanky. Now they have an interesting social structure. The females are sedentary, and there are relatively few females on Earth. This isn't their natural setup. This is more just because they're refugees. This is who happens to land here. So there are about 40 adult males to every 1 adult female. So the males are nomadic. They roam. They work odd jobs. They trade and barter.
Okay.
They live really on the margins of society.
But how did they land here? I think you say they borrowed a spaceship or something?
Over the years, they've acquired many ships from various alien civilizations. So they don't have their own indigenously designed fleet. They do have a number of advanced spacecraft that they keep hidden using cloaking devices.
Okay, so we still need to kind of get back to this original train, is that at some point working with the U.S. military and in the U.S., you and or Squatch felt it necessary to leave, and you negotiated and made a deal with the Israelis, right?
Yes.
So what was the nature of why you left?
Squatch did not trust the United States government. Squatch did not trust the United States government to protect its species from being exploited by either Dracos or Pleiadians. Squatch sees Earth as a battleground between Dracos and Pleiadians. They came here as refugees thinking they were safe. It turned out they were not safe. So they keep hidden. But this one had been discovered, and it was very scared. So I had become very emotionally close to Squatch. We all had, but especially me. So I and Squatch were sort of seen as the prime decision makers. And it was really our call, and we both agreed that it would be better for Black Kraken to operate independently from the authority of the federal government, and that we could better protect this individual Squatch if we were to make an alliance with a foreign power. Now, Israel was chosen because I believe I told you, Black Kraken, we were the egghead jarheads. A number of us were Jewish, and we qualified for birthright. Sorry, not for the right of return. So we were able to become Israeli citizens fairly easily without a lot of questions asked, and that was really the rationale. That happened to be very accessible to us. And so you wanted to know about where I've been living and under what conditions, right?
Well, yes, but I also want to know how did you get him out? How did you escape from the U.S.? Were you assisted by other soldiers?
So this is where we're edging up on things I can't directly comment on. I can say that I committed what could be considered crimes. Now, the issue with being charged with anything is that they would have to acknowledge my unit exists. They would have to acknowledge that Squatch exists. So because they can't afford to blow that cover up, they can't actually proceed with any kind of formal extradition request.
Okay, but we did discuss that even the reason you're coming forward right now is almost as a platform to try to get back into the U.S. and in their good graces, if you will, and also as a tentative disclosure rollout of a kind for humans to begin to understand that there are other races out there. This is a race that they have certainly been rumored to exist on our planet for, many years. And I've actually done interviews with other people who have interacted with Squatch or Yetis, as you, whatever you want to call them. And, in the Pacific Northwest, especially, and believe that they are communicating with them. I'm not sure whether they're doing it the way you're doing it, not necessarily telepathically, although maybe in some cases they are. But so you left the US and you managed to get this being out of here with you.
Yes.
And you went over to Israel and they established a habitat for the being as well as for you and your group. Right?
The habitat was constructed inside an abandoned missile silo. We were given the use of an old military base that the IDF was not currently using, but maintained as kind of a reserve outpost. Right now, I'm about 80 clicks outside Tel Aviv. I'm underground. We're boosting the signal so that we can have this conversation. I spend most of my day underground. The Squatch obviously is not accustomed to a desert environment. So the Squatch is kept in a protected habitat where no Pleiadian or Draco infiltrator can get to him. He's under round-the-clock guard. we try to make sure that he has adequately stimulating entertainment. We have mental health experts caring for him. He is in constant contact with the rest of his species through the overmind. I did want to just make a quick this is one of those bug up my butt because I'm an anthropologist things. But when we talk about extraterrestrial species, we really shouldn't use the term race. Race is really a human construct, doesn't really apply to extraterrestrial species.
Okay. Well, I use it in the term of human race as opposed to, races per se. So when I say, just in general, but that's fine. So you want to see extraterrestrial species. So they're a species. That's an acceptable term.
That's the scientific terminology. Race isn't a scientific term.
I hear you. All right. So species. So as a species, you're dealing with this particular individual, but his contact is with this did you call it an overmind?
Overmind, yes.
Okay, overmind. And would you liken it at all to what dogs and other, and cats do share among their species, or no?
It's different because their mind is more understandably ordered from an anthropocentric, human perspective, because they are of a similar, well, actually greater intelligence than ourselves, because they have these incredibly complex minds. They are, like us, better able to synthesize information and make connections and draw meaning on a more than instinctual level. So there's a kind of constant dialogue between all members of the species. Okay,
so let's clarify that for the audience. So you consider them, or you believe they are, as a species, more intelligent than humans. Do you believe they're more intelligent than dolphins, or they simply have a different kind of intelligence?
Well, it's a hard comparison. I don't think they're more intelligent than dolphins. I use humans as a direct comparison because we are physically more similar to them than we are to dolphins. We are tool users. We have verbal linguistic communication. It's easier to draw comparisons between us and the Squatch than it is to draw comparisons between us and dolphins, or the Squatch and dolphins.
All right. Well, then, would you compare their intelligence to, let's say, to the insectoids, to the Draco, to the reptilians? If you were going to put them on some kind of scale, is it equal or less than or greater than, or do you know?
It's about Pleiadian level. They're as old as the Pleiadians. They've coexisted with the Pleiadians a long time. Some of the Pleiadians' beliefs actually came from them.
All right. So they're considered to be, from what I understand, a six-dimensional species.
Yes.
Okay. So just to, and they may be now going above the sixth dimension, at least the Pleiadians, from what I understand, or factions of the Pleiadians.
The overmind stretches across the sixth dimension.
All right. And so when you're in touch with the overmind, are you also in the same room with Squatch in order to do that, or is that not necessary?
It was necessary at first, but as we became more bonded, less of we don't need line of sight anymore.
All right. And so you learned about their history through your contact with their overmind. Is that correct?
Yes.
And to some degree, possibly your discussions with Squatch?
Yes.
All right. Now, when you got recruited to interact with Squatch, were you excited? Had you already heard of the Sasquatch? In other words, was it a great opportunity?
Terry, I was thrilled. This was the dream of a lifetime, because we're talking about a being. So I do believe there is some kind of genetic relationship between their evolutionary lineage and ours. There are too many similarities to ignore. Looking at Squatch was almost like looking at a missing link, but not just a missing link connecting us to our past. It was a missing link connecting us to our past and also to the stars and to our future. So the initial communication flourished into something. I describe it as emotional. I have developed an affinity for the Squatch. I have come to recognize traces in myself on an order like a starseed. So, like the Pleiadians have starseed connections, they have been active in the evolution of life on multiple worlds. So, in an intimate way, was the Squatch.
Well, what is your understanding of their relationship to Lyra? Because Lyra is considered to be where a lot of humanoid species come from. Did the Squatch have any kind of relationship to that system?
Yeah. So one thing that's important to understand, and I think this applies to very human-like extraterrestrials who may be related to us as it does to humans on Earth. When we talk about, I get very specific about language because of my background. So when we talk about the human species, they're actually at some point in the distant past, there were multiple human species. There were Neanderthals, the hobbits from Flores. Human really is a genus. Human doesn't refer to a race or a species. It refers to a genus of the hominins. So when we look back, say, 80,000 years ago on Earth, we would have seen a much more diverse human spectrum. There was an evolutionary bottleneck event, something like 80,000 years ago, in which the living human population was reduced down to just barely the number of breeding pairs that it took for the species to sustain itself and survive with any kind of healthy genetic diversity. So when you look at humans today, you're looking at a pie slice of what human diversity has been like for the majority of the existence of human life on this planet. So it applies similarly with closely humanoid extraterrestrial beings like the Pleiadians, who are, in a way of speaking, our cousins. Mm-hmm. And similarly, Squatch is also from a cousin species. You could even call them a kind of proto-Pleiadian.
Okay, but do you know what cousin species you're talking about for the Squatch?
Of us and of the Pleiadians.
Okay, but what cousin? What one would that be? If it's not me, if it's not humans and it's not Pleiadians, is there what would you give a name to that cousin?
Well, I've referred to them as the Squatches.
Okay, so okay. I guess, okay, let's talk about the Anunnaki, because my understanding of the Anunnaki is that they were also invaded by Draco, and yes, they became what I call a humanoid, reptilian,
yes,
species. So
my learnings about the hierarchy of the Draco Empire have led me to the conclusion that what we are looking at is a kind of assimilation plot. So in Earth history, when people from a more advanced civilization encountered people from a less technologically advanced civilization, often these groups were subsumed into the population. There was assimilation culturally and genetically. Similar assimilation happened in outer space.
Right.
The Draco Empire is a hierarchy. It is a hierarchy of reptilian beings. So you have the Draco bloodline, who are like the pure baseline Draco.
Well, and they're called the Shakar, at least to my knowledge.
Yes.
How we refer to them.
I believe that's the term they use for themselves.
Okay, and they have wings, what they call the Draco royalty.
Yes. Now, there are various subspecies of Draco that could be considered similar to the castes in an insect colony. Although obviously Draco are not insectoid, but they have engineered sort of lower ranking members of their species to perform certain functions. So there are, for example, warrior Draco, scientist Draco, and then they have infiltrator castes, the reptoids, which are human Draco hybrids. Now, those reptoids that I'm referring to, those are the ones I said we're familiar with because of their activities on Earth. But on other planets where the Draco have invaded and taken over and assimilated, they have produced various hybrid groups. So the Anunnaki originally were, I believe, one of the Pleiadian groups, or at least related to the Pleiadians, or hailing from Lyra originally. They were part of that same wave of interstellar migration.
Right.
Now, they at some point in the distant past encountered the Draco and were to some extent genetically assimilated into a more of a reptilian kind of life form.
But they do still have some that look more human than others, and some that look more reptoid or reptilian than others. And okay, but now remember that we had a discussion about how the Squatch, his race, or sorry, his species deals with the Anunnaki, because the Anunnaki are very present in Israel and Israeli government. So there is some kind of a suspicious relationship there as well, right?
There is, but the Squatch are a little more trusting of the Anunnaki than they would be of pure Draco or pure Pleiadians, because there's a history of conquest. The Anunnaki today are a conquered people, and they're a divided people. There are different, contested claims about which of these groups represents the species, who can speak for them. The reptilians or the more humanoid Anunnaki. And this has been a way that the Draco Empire has maintained control over Anunnaki territory. It's divide and conquer. It's the same thing elites have done for thousands of years on Earth.
Right. Okay.
Now, on the other hand, the Guardians are not just the Pleiadians. There are other collectives of beings in the Guardian Alliance. And I've learned of very intriguing, diverse life forms that would have been represented on ancient Mars in its cosmopolitan days. I'm aware of a cuttlefish-like species that lives on gas giants, in the atmospheres of gas giants, and they are controlled by a benevolent AI.
Well, it is also said that the Draco are actually controlled by an AI.
But theirs is not benevolent.
And that's an understatement, but yes, yes. So, okay. Now, okay, but this is a very interesting sort of dynamic going on here, right? So what you did was you left the United States because it wasn't conducive to this particular Squatch's future, but in a sense, this is an ambassador. That's how I referred to them. I don't know if you consider that accurate, of the Squatches here on Earth, and that this particular being, because he was captured, has now sort of taken on a role, if you will, right? Because of his interaction with you and this experiments that you're
part of. It's a great pressure on him because he's a very young Squatch. So it's interesting that you say that, because as I mentioned, they don't take on individual names, they have titles. So the ambassador would be a great title for him, and I hope that his people consider that he is earning that title, as is their tradition. He is our ambassador, and he's been very generous and patient with us as we have attempted to learn more about him and how best to support him. He asked for us to take him outside the United States. He asked for us to contact a foreign power. This all is inside baseball. It's all Illuminati inside baseball. The Zionists are one faction, a human faction. The Vatican is another. I believe I mentioned my colonel, Lionel Sperlinghetti. He's very much a Vatican insider. I'm not, but I take my orders from him. I trust him to represent my interests, and I know which side butters my bread. But these are all factions within the human arm of the secret space program. So secret space program isn't really a term that I or an insider would really use. We would more likely refer to one of the various programs like Solar Warden, Radiant Guardian, Black Kraken. But broadly, the umbrella of secret space programs are contested. And so there's a lot of fast kind of political action between these factions. Things change on a daily basis. Alliances shift. And we just wanted to have an avenue for not just this particular Squatch. This Squatch, yes, because he was in our custody, but his species is here. They're living in places like the Pacific Northwest. There may also be Squatch colonies in the Himalayas, in Tibet. There might be colonies in the Northeast. There have been sightings all over the world of a humanoid primate. So Squatch wanted us to forge ahead in an independent direction, and for that we needed the backing of a foreign power to shelter us. Israel had the facilities, and due to the legal status of Jews in Israel, it was easy for us to obtain citizenship. But
I want to sort of discuss this idea that, first of all, you also said you wanted to come back.
Yes.
Because Israel has not actually, I'm not sure it's Israel per se, it's a faction of Israel, perhaps even the Anunnaki, that have not kept up their side of the bargain, so to speak.
Well, they've kept up their side of the bargain. It's just that their side of the bargain was very basic. It wasn't much more than, physical protection for Squatch and for ourselves, the use of their facility. They provided some engineers who helped, make sure the Squatch's habitat was secure and comfortable. Like I said, that was
well, let me ask you this. Who is it in your group or even outside your group that has sort of orchestrated this interview in such a way that you can talk about this, which it's been going on for several years, and it, in a certain sense, you've become, or you could become a kind of a political football, if people even acknowledge this interview and your existence.
That's a good way of putting it.
And so there seems to be a reason for that. And one of the reasons that I can see, at least at this moment, because, as you know, in the greater world scene, we have this kind of, dark versus light drama being played out, especially in heightened terms within the United States. And so, it's an interesting, we call it playing the alien card, right? So it is a more local, so-called alien species, if you want to call them. They may not like the term alien, but let's call those local alien species, because that's what the conventional person watching this might think of that.
Yes.
They're not going to think of, they probably, and I know that most people out there don't even think of Sasquatch as an alien species. They just
they think he's the missing link.
But they also think they're, very few and far between. They don't think of them as a whole population
society.
Coming from another, coming from outer space.
Yes.
Other planets that they had to leave. So it creates a picture and a drama that is maybe more easy for the average human out here to grasp, because they never seem to be able to really grasp the fact that there are other species out there on other planets, et cetera, and that these species have a right to life and so on and so forth. So it does provide a very easy learning tool, very kind of on a remedial level. And yet this species themselves is actually quite advanced, right? As you're saying,
Yes.
You think technically more intelligent than humans, which I'm sure could be contested out there. I don't know how these things will be proven, right?
I think their collective intelligence gives them an advantage.
Sure.
The fact of the overmind permeating all facets of their existence, it allows them to exchange information and reason and arrive at conclusions faster together than any one individual of us might be.
Well, it's like we do call it the universal mind, what humans have access to as well, which could make us smarter instantly if we.
Yes.
I talked to lots of scientists and various engineers who worked in what we call black projects, such as yours, for, let's say, 40 years of their life. One in particular, Pete Peterson, would call it the information field that surrounds us. So that humans, just like Jung said, they have access to this universal mind if they want to. So that in a certain way, if we were more conscious of it, would also be very similar to what you're describing. At least it sounds more similar. Even though we don't acknowledge our telepathic abilities, we do all have telepathy. And
yes, and this was something the Squatches learned. It wasn't like they had an innate intelligence that we lack, or an innate ability to telepathically communicate that we lack. It's more that they are further along the process of maturation as a species than we are. They have been around a longer time.
They live longer.
They live longer, and they've been more places than we have. They've been on many different planets, and So this diversity of experience translates to sort of this cornucopia of adaptability, flexibility in the overmind. They're very flexible, adaptive beings.
Okay, now I want to ask you a strange question, but I'm sure you can handle it. So you've been in touch with this overmind of the Sasquatch. And in so doing, do you feel that you have therefore, kind of like you've traveled in that mind space, so you can converse in that mind space because you at least can, learn things there, you said, about their history, et cetera, right?
Yes.
And I assume perhaps you can send and receive signals to individuals within that mind space?
Squatch can. I've been able to do that, but not consistently. I'm still learning.
All right. And so that in a certain way, let's say I'm talking to you, and let's say you're in telepathic communication with another human, not necessarily me, but anyone who you're even close to somebody, and yet you're telepathic with, because once you're telepathic, it's sort of a natural inclination to try to be telepathic with anyone you have an affinity for, let's say, right?
Yes.
So if you did that, would they be able to then tap into this overmind through you? If they
It's entirely possible. It's one of those situations where they have to know what they're looking for. It's a little bit like with Target in remote viewing. They have to have a target. They have to have some inkling that what they are, the infrastructure they are seeking to connect with exists.
All right. Well, what if that that mind wanted to send a message? They could send it, in theory, they could use you as a carrier to then send it telepathically to other humans. Isn't that possible?
They could, and I might not even know that is what's happening.
Right. And so even setting this up, let's say this interview, isn't it possible that that's what happened?
It's entirely possible. I don't know. I am a scientist, so I have to admit the possibility. It's plausible. It works as a hypothesis.
But you haven't investigated it.
No, I haven't, and I don't like to comment on things I haven't personally investigated. I think that's not a responsible thing for a scientist to do.
Okay, then let me ask you another question about this sort of thing. I did ask you off the record this as well. Is Squatch in touch telepathically with the Anunnaki? And I think you said no.
The answer is no, but that is more by choice. The overmind can't work against your will. The overmind can influence you, but it can't make you or any individual in it do something against their will. So it's not like the Anunnaki can invade the overmind.
Okay.
They can't just force their way through it. They can't brute force it. Squatch would have to let them in, like Squatch let me in.
Okay. Are they so? Well, then along those lines, is that overmind particularly protected with regard to other species invading it? Because of course, the Draco wanting power over others would certainly try to find access, wouldn't it?
Well, the Squatch overmind is very strong. It's just very highly developed. They've been building up, reinforcing it, you could say, for millennia. They're very long-lived beings, so they bring a lot of experience of mental discipline, especially as the older they get. Squatch himself, like I said, is barely out of adolescence, but the older Squatches bring a lot of mental and emotional and spiritual discipline to the Overmind, and that sort of balances out the impulsiveness of the young ones.
So how long?
I did want to clarify about I want to reiterate, it's not any kind of hive mind. It's more like a computer network.
I understand. I'm just, even a computer network can be infiltrated. What I'm interested in is, when you say eons or whatever, or millennia, do you actually know, first of all, how long each, like this long-lived Sasquatches are? Do they live different lengths of time, or is it on average? Because when you say 300 years, it almost sounds like 1,000 years is their average lifespan. Is that right?
About the Wizard of Washington that I mentioned earlier is about 1,200 years old, and that's considered ripe old age, but not. He's not an invalid. He's still quite physically healthy, able to live on his own, take care of himself. Some memory problems here and there, but the Overmind compensates for that.
Okay, so one of the things we also discussed is that they don't necessarily build structures like, humans do, like, Rome and, all this kind of stuff, cities and buildings and technology, that kind of thing. So can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, so the ones that are here as refugees on Earth probably aren't very representative of what their species was like at its height, when they had their own homeworlds and they did have their own cities and their own ships. The situation here on Earth, first of all, their social structure is affected by the fact that most of the refugees were male. So that makes females very scarce. So there are all kinds of complicated arrangements having to do with mating that wouldn't necessarily be representative of what they would be like if, say, they had their own city somewhere with more equal distribution. So they really live, it's not that they don't build anything, but they kind of live on the margins of society. They often will. The ones who pass as human will rent studio apartments or live in trailers or, small, homesteads, bungalows. But the ones who choose to live in the wild prefer to live as their ancient ancestors did. So while they're very advanced beings, you see them, the ones that have been sighted, the ones that don't shave, that have their body hair intact, they misleadingly appear to be primitives. Mm-hmm. But this is sort of like that Outer Limits episode where the spaceship discovers the alien Boy Scouts, and it turns out that the aliens who they thought were primitives are actually like the Boy Scouts of their people. So then the spaceship comes and their parents are back. It's that.
Okay. Now, what about this idea? You said they're sort of a nomadic out of necessity because they were conquered or invaded, let's say, by other species such as the Draco. Mm-hmm. So do they have other planets that we would recognize the names of, for example, that they are currently living on, or are you at liberty to say that much?
I suspect that they are distributed similarly like they are on Earth throughout various alien empires. I don't think necessarily the extreme male to female ratio on Earth is typical. Like, I think that's just a weird fluke of like who ended up landing here. It's one of those founder effect problems. So their presence on Earth is very marginal, largely because it's hard for them to sustain their community. I don't know that that's necessarily the case on other planets. I know that within the solar system, there are a number of planets whose existence hasn't been revealed yet to the general public. And it's possible that there are other colonies of Squatches out there.
Oh, all right. Now, I wonder, so they captured this particular Squatch, but so it kind of sounds like this is an unusual occurrence. They haven't actually captured very many, it sounds like. And if they have, the humans haven't been able to develop a kind of species to species working relationship in which they might be able to be assisted by the Sasquatch or Squatch.
Well, we have. They're very rare, but they do work out. There are humans who are aware of what they are. They've worked out little barter systems and trade deals, labor, finished goods.
I actually mean in a substantial way, such as helping with our space, exploration, or things that they might actually know about.
Yes.
Because of their longevity, and they could be like, I don't know, ET human interpreters, or, there's lots of interactions that they could benefit our world with. Also having to do with, educating, I don't know, the United Nations, unfortunately, what it's conceived of, but you know what I mean? In other words,
historically, they did try to do that.
What?
There have been times in their past when they have done that on other planets,
right?
When they tried to share the benefit of their experience and their wisdom with other planets, but it always seemed to backfire because of the xenophobia. So the hatred against them, the fear of them. Their otherness, and being different from Pleiadians and different from Dracos, was always held against them, no matter how they contributed to the planets where they lived. So on Earth now, they're much more cautious, so they're much rarer.
All right. Well, maybe this particular effort that you're part of is sort of a new direction for them. Because if they're truly, more experienced and more intelligent, then this Earth and humans could definitely benefit from getting to know them and from their assistance. Seems to me.
Yes, certainly. And when they're ready, when more of us have earned their trust, I'm sure that we'll see the benefits of that relationship.
Are they aware of inner Earth civilizations?
Inner Earth, did you say?
Inner Earth, yeah, inner Earth.
Yes, to the same degree that humans in the know are.
So they don't have a special entree into inner Earth by virtue of them. Some of the inner Earth cultures are considered to be more advanced than the surface Earth.
Right. Well, they are aware of those societies. They don't directly interact with them because they are surface-dwelling beings. But the overmind is able to probe, the minds of any, sentient group on the planet Earth. It can't invade them, but it can locate and define them.
Okay. Now, so in terms of like the nature of your interactions? I guess we didn't really talk about how they, you know, how they're not like having a lot of babies, right?
No,
So, but
reproduction is very rare.
rare. Okay. What is your long range plan though? Because you did sort of hint at that you wanted to get sort of more of a normal life, and that this individual may also, because I asked you if he wants to visit or go back to be among his people, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
He does, yes. He considers what he's doing right now a great sacrifice for his people. He's reassured by the fact of the overmind that he's never truly alone, but being physically separate is not as trying for them as it is for us, because they tend to be, they're large primates. They tend to be very solitary organisms. The males are nomadic. They live kind of a roaming lifestyle. But he certainly would like to be back in the Northwest when it is safer, and when his people can be assured of, first, that they're not going to be propagandistically exploited by either faction in a war that they don't consider their struggle. And also, ideally, they would like a homeland. They would like to know that there's a place for them that they can call their home, and that if Earth proves to be influential enough in what is transpiring between the Draco, the Luciferian Alliance, and the Guardian Alliance, if we can somehow help assure them a homeland, they would be extremely grateful toward humans.
Okay, very interesting. Now, I don't know how long I've been talking to you. It's we started around, I think it was 2:30, so it's about 2 to 3, I guess it's about 2 hours. I don't want this to go on too long, because I'd like to have you back, first of all, but I also want to make sure that we ask or get you, give you the chance to say any critical information that you would like to say that hasn't been said. Can you think of anything that we haven't really talked about, that at least, the Squatch, do you call him Squatch or do you call him by a name?
I call him Squatch because his people don't really use names.
All right. Well,
but I will be calling him the ambassador from now on, and I will encourage him to call himself that. In his dialogue in the Overmind with his people, I think that's a great moniker for him.
All right, lovely. So this ambassador, is there any questions or statements that you haven't made that you would like to make on his behalf at this time?
No, just that we are both very grateful for the opportunity to present our side of the story, and hopefully bring a little light and nuance into this whole complex situation with Dracos and Pleiadians, because I think some of the reporting I've seen elsewhere on that has been very kind of one-sided, moralistic, good and evil. And I always preferred Star Trek to Star Wars. I don't know about you, but I like the the complex storytelling. I like the fact that the antagonists in Star Trek were never really villains, and that's kind of the way I try to see the world. Is that people may be antagonistic to us, but ultimately we're all sentient beings. We all just want life and dignity and freedom. Okay,
very nicely said. What about this drama that we're currently experiencing? You can't have been completely detached from it, even if you are underground to some degree. So the idea of this transhuman agenda, this rollout of trying to link everyone to the Borg and so on. Has this sort of rollout, or whatever you want to call it, by the Dracos impacted you and Squatch in any particular ways that that has changed or had
Yeah.
on things?
Yeah, it moved up our timetable for disclosure. It forced us to act a little bit more quickly and boldly than I think was our original assumption. We thought we could just hide out in Israel and work things out behind the scenes. But we've been trying that for several years now, and we're still sort of stuck here. I'm from New York State. I'm a Northeast guy. I don't like living in the desert. Squash doesn't like the desert. That's nothing against people from the desert. It's just not where I'm most comfortable. I want to go home. I want to see New York and Philadelphia again. I want to eat a cheesesteak and hang out at Temple University and smoke a Black and Mild.
Okay, now I'm going to go back to the beginning where you talked about a Stargate situation that you were part of in Afghanistan and Iraq. Was that correct?
There were two separate incidents, both involving Greys. And what was interesting this time, the Greys wore powered armor during these incidents. We didn't know they had powered armor.
All right. And how tall were these particular Greys?
These Greys, well, there were taller Greys directing them, and sort of the foot soldiers were the smaller Greys, about 4 or 5 foot tall. The taller Greys were about 6, 7 foot tall.
Why did you call it a Stargate incident? What were you talking about when you referred to that?
So in Baghdad and Kabul, there were dig sites. There were archaeological sites where gate-like devices were discovered. They were theorized to be part of a kind of portal network, linking various planets. That would have been an ancient system for when space travel was much more rare and difficult than it is today. So they would send a sleeper ship, like a sublight ship, to a distant planet, and a crew or robots would construct a gate, and then they would send more material and personnel through the gate. So these were ancient transportation systems that we rediscovered in the Middle East. And at 2 separate points during our conflicts in the Middle East, these stargates were activated. Now, the activation resulted in something like what happened decades ago at Dulce Base. So all of a sudden, we were invaded, and not by ships. They materialized there in the room from the gate. So all of a sudden, we were surrounded by ETs in powered armor.
And but were they all Greys?
They were Greys, yes. These were Greys. There were tall Greys. They appeared to be the leaders, the leadership. And there were subordinate Greys that were smaller, shorter, who I believe might be a kind of biological robot. I'm not certain on that, but they certainly behave more robotically than the tall Greys. The tall Greys seem to have more of a human-like intelligence, a sense of individuality, whereas the short Greys, they're almost like insects, like the Borg.
Right. I call them drones, but
yeah, that's the word I was thinking of. Drones. Yeah.
Yeah.
Drones.
But you're saying, so there were 2 Stargate incidents that you were involved in. So why were you involved?
I was there as a cultural liaison. That was during my early service period. So I was just a young guy. I had a passing familiarity with the history of the region. some of the local cultures. I was basically there to make sure that our soldiers were appropriate and behaved with courtesy and respect toward the locals. I was there in kind of like an oversight, supportive role to the combat troops, just trying to help the combat troops not make cultural faux pas. So that was what I was doing. I had already been briefed on Roswell at that point, but I wasn't doing anything specific to combat with extraterrestrials. I was with a combat unit in a support role that happened to get caught up in the first Stargate incident. And then when the Stargate in the other city activated 2 years later, they called me in, as well as all the other people who had been at the first Stargate incident.
Okay, and what year was this approximately?
The second Stargate incident was in 2008, I believe. The first was in 2006. The first was in Baghdad. The second was in Kabul.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. Now, I was going to ask you this question, and then I guess I'm going to wrap this up. But you know how in the movie E.T., the child becomes has an affinity that develops with E.T., right?
Yes.
Such that the child is being telepathic with ET in theory, and that at the same time he's also being empathetic. So as an empath, in a sense, the child starts to feel like, I think what happened in the movie was, I think ET drank some beer or something.
The child had a sympathetic response.
Yeah. So do you feel that you have that kind of empathetic relationship with Squatch?
Yeah, I actually have to avoid things like alcohol because I don't know what the effect that it will have on Squatch's brain.
Mm-hmm.
I try to be more mindful of what I expose myself to, given that I know that there is some kind of a feedback loop that I don't have any direct control over. It's an organic process.
All right.
I will also say that when I was 6 years old, E.T. was my absolute favorite movie. My grandfather bought me the VHS cassette. It was the one that had like green plastic on it. I must have worn that cassette out watching it 200 times.
All right. So you already had that, sort of abilities, that your abilities were sort of really why you became what you became, in a sense. You already had the abilities, right?
Well, all of us have the abilities.
I know, but some have them more than, you have it in predominantly.
I would say I have a curious mind, and I had a predisposition toward empathizing with the other, trying to understand beings that were different from me. I was always very fond of animals. I was always very active in a lot of, progressive justice causes. I've always been kind of a passionate advocate for people. I joined the military because I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself and genuinely help people in need. I've always sort of seen my role here as being of service to others.
Sure. Understandably. All right. Very, very fascinating, Major Berg. So I'm sure that people are going to be really fascinated by this interview, I think. And so would you like to give out any contact or ways they can contact you? You may be inundated by invitations and so on. So
at this stage, I'm going to pass on that. I haven't been given clearance to do that.
I see.
That's a conversation I can have with Owl and our other backers.
Okay.
So I'll speak about that with them, but at this time I don't want to give out any contact information.
Okay. Do you want me to forward emails from people?
That would be amazing. I believe I gave you my email address.
Yeah, I'm not positive that I have your email. I know I have another way of communicating with you, but I'm not.
Yeah.
You can do that. I mean, you might have done that. I just don't remember at this moment.
Well, any way you want to communicate that to me is fine. I would be interested in seeing people's response to this. I know it's a lot to take in. I'm not expecting everyone is going to necessarily be sympathetic towards Squatch. I understand there's some barriers and, you know, there's work to be done. But it would be good. It would be good to follow up on this.
Okay, well, I hope we can do more interviews. I'd certainly like to discuss with you as we kind of managed to touch on a lot of subjects offline.
Yeah, there's a lot about Mars I couldn't go into because we don't have the time, but I'd be happy to talk about it another time with you.
So let's actually, you know, at this point say that we'll do another interview and we'll do it about Mars more so as well. And then I'd like to also branch into other areas because from what I understand in my talking with you, you seem to have a lot of the same awareness of these other species out there, even when you haven't dealt with them directly. So your picture is a lot bigger than a lot of people's out there in terms of. And one of my witnesses, Captain Mark Richards, has that kind of knowledge, and it's really a pleasure to talk to someone like that. Well,
thank you, Carrie. It was a pleasure speaking with you. It's a pleasure speaking with someone who's open to having these kinds of conversations.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and please give our regards, if possible, to Squatch.
I will.
Or Mr. Ambassador, and I hope we can go along this road with him. Because I think that's a really beautiful picture that you painted of their species and their dilemma. And I think it's very important that it be considered here on Earth. And
I'm glad to know he has your support.
And I think
I'm sure he'll be appreciative.
On the road to understanding, you know, to intergalactic civilizations, interactions, and creating a, modes of communication that are ongoing with these various species and so on, that they are communicating individually here with people on Earth, as you know.
Yes.
And that goes across the board, really. And then I guess governments and various militaries are trying to have communications with various groups. But
yes, and their criteria for selecting who they communicate with, it comes from an alien mentality. It's not the same criteria we would use. So I think when you look at the history of contact, the history of contactees, you know, you see that there's an alien kind of selectiveness. And that would be a very interesting topic to discuss because I have some theories about that.
Oh, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah. But another time then. It was wonderful being on your show, Carrie. Congratulations on the move.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Take care, and we'll do this again. All right?
Goodbye.
Okay. Bye-bye.